On 9/11/2001, I was working at the Kennedy Space Center. I was actually the executive director of the Cape Canaveral Spaceport Management Office. And on that day, which I believe was a Monday, we were driving from the Kennedy Space Center to Vero Beach, Florida for our annual offsite. We were driving down on a bus, and all of the senior managers from Kennedy were on that bus, and there were several TVs on. And I recall that partway down to Vero Beach, Dave King, who is the director of shuttle processing, told a group of us that CNN was reporting that an airplane had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. I think pretty much all of us figured it was similar to airplane accidents, private airplane accidents that had occurred over the years, and we didn't consider that there was anything unusual going on. But then very shortly thereafter, we heard of the second airplane crashing into the World Trade Center, and then we saw the images on the television, which were just pretty horrific. And we knew something different was going on in the world. And the events of that day were fairly chaotic because we had the two planes flying into the World Trade Center, and then an airplane flying into the Pentagon, and then there was a report of an airplane crashing in Pennsylvania. So we knew something was going on in the world, probably not a good thing. We continued our drive down to Vero Beach, and when we arrived there, we collectively made a decision to meet and have lunch, and then have a conversation about what we were going to do from that point forward. We all agreed that given the uncertainty of what was going on in the world, that being away from the center was not a good decision, and so we collectively agreed to pack our things and to return to Kennedy. I can say there wasn't a whole lot of talking in the bus on the way back, and over the next few days, as these events unfolded, I found it difficult at times to sleep, and I would find myself waking up in the middle of the night and turning on the television and seeing people, family members, loved ones, friends, with pictures, basically asking for help to locate people that might have been involved in the World Trade Center tragedy. So I would say that there are life events that occur in everybody's life. I can remember the day John F. Kennedy was killed. I can remember the day of the Challenger accident, and I can clearly remember the day of 9/11/2001 as a day that will forever be etched in my mind.
Okay, September 11th, 2001. I was at work that day. We were working in Building 60, and we were having a project meeting, and I remember a woman coming in and saying, with a look of shock on her face, telling us that an airplane had flown into the World Trade Center. We were actually working aviation safety at the time, so we thought it was an accident. But she didn't leave. She went on to say that you need to come and look at this. And the library was in the same building at that time, and we walked down to the library. They had a TV there, and we saw what was happening. And at that time, I also looked out the window, and the cars were starting to line up. Clearly, people were worried and starting to leave work. I went back to my cubicle and tried calling my wife. Couldn't get through. Tried the cell phone. Couldn't get through there either. So I made the decision at that time to just leave. So I remember the traffic being backed up all the way to down 71. It was a very eerie feeling. Had the radio on and the coverage, listening to the coverage, and I remember them talking about an airplane being over the Cleveland area. So the next thought that went through my mind is, the family and how things are back at home. So anyway, I got home okay. Everybody was fine. We just ended up watching the coverage the rest of the day. So what did all this mean to me? It just showed how vulnerable we really are and what's really important. in life, and I will have that with me till the day I die.
My name is John Kaminsky. I work in the CFO's office, and on September 11th, 2001, I was at my desk working, but I was listening to the radio, and I heard that a plane had hit the World Trade Center in New York City, and you know, the people on the radio were like in shock, and so I went out into the hall and asked some other people if they heard anything, and no one did. So we went down to one supervisor's office. There was a television in that room, and we turned it on, and we were all just devastated, and the talk going around the room, people were talking about terrorism and everything, and it was a scary time, and no one really knew what to think. So what did it mean to me? I don't know. It was humbling, I guess.
I'm Julie Sheneman, and I work in the office of the CFO. On 9/11, I was in Huntsville, Alabama, with a large group of people implementing the new SAP accounting system. I had my nanny and my daughter along with me because I was supposed to be there for an extended time. I remember getting up that morning and going down for breakfast at the hotel and watching the TV and realizing that the first tower had been hit, and wondering, everyone was wondering what was going on, and everyone in the room was anxious. And I remember sitting there watching the TV as the second plane hit the tower, and everyone there in the room knew instantly that there was more to it than just an accident. So the group got together and figured we might as well go into Marshall. Hopefully they would know more than we would know and help us with instructions on what we should do. We did that, and they sent us back to our hotel rooms and said wait for further instructions. Of course, we all got together that night and tried to contact our families and make sure everyone was okay. The next morning at Marshall, they called us in and told us that they had arranged for rental cars, that we should all go get one and go home. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to get my baby, I wanted to go find my husband and get together and with the rest of the country figure out what was going on and where we go from here. So 9/11 was a crazy day, and that's what I was doing on 9/11.
Hi, I'm Vicki Hagerman, and I work in the CFO's office. And on September 11th, And on September 11th, I actually was in Huntsville, Alabama, working on a project. My family was separated. My kids were in college, and my husband was at home. And my first thoughts were, I want my family together. We all gathered around a TV set there in Huntsville, Alabama, and looked around, and almost everyone had tears in their eyes. The project wasn't important at that time, but it was important for our nation. So that day was really something I don't think I'll ever forget, and forget the emotions that my family had, and all of us calling and trying to make sure everybody was okay. So that's where I was at.
My name is Brittany Russ. I work in the CFO's office. On September 11th, I was in geometry class in high school, and it's a day that I'll absolutely never forget because my dad was traveling that day. So we couldn't get a hold of him for a really long time because his flight was switched from Chicago to another city in Philadelphia. And we had no idea where he was all day. And you instantly are scared for our whole family and for his safety. And I feel terrible for all the people that lost somebody on September 11th.
On 9/11, I was working at the time at Ogilvy Norton Company, and one of the people in our IT department had a television in their office, and when it started, we tuned into the television, and everybody was fascinated by the building on fire and in horror. And then when the buildings collapsed, we ended up being sent home early. The meaning to me was that realization that America wasn't immune from attacks, and it really hasn't been the same since.
Hi, I'm Rachel Settlemeyer. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton in the CFO office. 9/11, I actually was working at a different company for a bank, and if anyone goes into the bank, we really don't have much of insight into the outside world during normal banking hours. So I never knew what was going on until a customer came in and said, "Hey, have you guys listened to the news or seen anything on TV or anything?" And we said, "No, what are you talking about?" And so from that point on, we turned on the radio and we started listening to what was going on, and everyone just sort of stopped what they were doing and, was just shocked by what was taking place. None of us were sent home. We had to stay where we were, so we just had to go about our day, and everyone started calling their loved ones, making sure that everybody knew what was going on and that people were watching it and seeing what was actually happening. So to me, 9/11, even though I didn't know what was going on right then and there, looking back at it, it's something I think that will make history books for kids that are my age. They're going to be reading about it in history books. So that's what it means to me.
Hi, this is Carolyn Massas. I work for BAC. Where I was on September 11th, I was in Code Q, and what was I doing? I was working. But I do recall having a small camera or a TV, and I remember seeing the newscast go on and seeing the second airplane hit the second towers. It was like a scene out of a movie for me, and it didn't really touch home until I saw the tower fall afterwards, and it was it was overwhelming for me to see something like that. What does it mean to you? That we are not invulnerable to what might happen in the terrorist attacks, and hopefully now that we have these new safeguards in place, we'll be better prepared for something like this in the future.
Perfect. Where were you?
September 11th, I was home on vacation. My spouse was in the military, so we were relaxing.
And what were you doing?
Spending time with my family and friends.
And what did it mean to you?
September 11th meant a lot to me. Due to the incident, my husband was called back and sent to war, so it definitely meant a lot to me. I had a family member in the Twin Towers when the Twin Towers was hit, so thankfully he made it out safe.
Thank you, God.
So it definitely meant a lot to me.
Orlando, where were you on September 11th?
Well, actually, when the planes attacked the building, actually, I was on my way down to downtown. I was in charge of the CFC that year. We was on our way downtown. We heard a airplane had hit a building, but we had no idea it was to that magnitude. I remember it was a Tuesday, about 10 o'clock.
What were you doing?
As I said, I was on my way down to, riding in a car actually, on my way downtown, and later on all the meetings, everything was canceled. Downtown was pretty much closed. The center was closed.
What did it mean to you?
It was a shock. It was a shock. Shock, but not shock in a way, but not totally shock. I've always felt, if someone has bad intentions of doing something, it's very easily to do. It's just run the risk of getting caught. So it was a shock that, and the lives lost. That was the most hurting part. The innocent people that lost their lives. That was probably the most hurting part for me of the whole ordeal.
I was at home getting ready to come to work here at NASA Glen when the word came. And I was in the process of we were waiting for an installer to come to install a new range at our home. My husband took off that day. So we saw the initial events occur. I hopped in the car and ran to work because I knew that NASA as a federal institution might need my help, so I hurriedly came to work.
The biggest thing for me that was kind of, I mean, it was surreal, it was unbelievable, you just kept watching, you couldn't see, you just couldn't imagine it was actually happening. And the thing that really hit for me was that I'd gone to spring break with 4 of my friends to New York City in 2000, and we went up to the top of the observation deck on the World Trade Center. So I'm sitting there looking on TV at the observation deck that we had gone to, and it was just a normal spring day for that, and this was just a normal fall day, and then all of a sudden it wasn't a normal day anymore. And it really hit to me about how a normal day anywhere could be an abnormal day and a significant day, you know, for other people or for anything. And so it was it was very jarring to think about how it could have just as easily been a day that we were out there, or a day that anybody was up, you know, watching and looking out on the observation deck, and you think it's just a normal holiday, a normal vacation in New York, and all of a sudden, you know, something's different.
Okay. Alrighty. Where were you on September 11th, 2001?
On September 11, 2001, I was at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio.
Alrighty. And what were you doing?
I just came to my dorm back from class.
Okay. And what did it mean to you?
Okay. 9/11 is a reminder for me that we're all interconnected, and the loss of a life is a reminder of the frailty of life and the belonging, being united, and what it means to belong to one nation that came together so quickly and so well under such tragic circumstances. Every 9/11, I definitely take a moment to remember all those people that lost someone they loved and the ones I love.
You know the drill. Here we go. All right, we're speeding. John, where were you when 9/11 happened?
I was working in Strongsville at a turf and lawn care company in their IT department.
And when you heard what happened, what do you remember?
A coworker got word that a plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers and somehow had a portable television. And I remember everyone gathering around on this little 3-inch square screen TV and watching the other plane hit, and just the chaos that was going on at the time in the area. I mean, we didn't know what was really going on, if it was just a plane crash, and then later as the story developed, we were under attack.
What was your feeling at that point?
I guess it's a lot of things. You're in shock. The devastation that happened, the suffering from the people. But I remember suddenly feeling vulnerable. We had this false sense of no one can touch the U.S. You know, we're this superpower, and in an instant that was all gone. And the fear of where else are attacks going to happen. I just remember driving home, and it was the quietest drive. There's not a plane, not a bird, not a sound anywhere. And that was the longest 30-minute highway drive ever. And then just seeing fighter planes, you know, flying every now and then. It just made you. It was just a weird feeling. You know, of course, as time went by, different emotions, but on that day, it was numbing. That's probably the best way to describe the feeling.
What stuck out to you the most of, you know, people coming together in the wake of this horrible tragedy?
Yeah, Americans were Americans, really, at that point. It didn't matter, white, black, Hispanic, you know, we were America, and for that period of time, a lot of the other issues didn't seem as bad. I mean, we had to stand together as a country, and you know, the whole patriotism movement, if you want to call it that, was sparked. So yeah, I mean, that's on that day. It was a wake-up call to a lot of things. There we go.
Okay. I was at home. I was running late for work and just about ready to head out the door, and the phone rang, and it was my mother saying, "Have you seen what happened in New York?" And I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" And she said, "Just turn on the TV." At the time that I turned on the TV was just before the second plane hit the second tower. And I was just absolutely in total shock because it became abundantly clear at that point that the United States was under attack, which was something that none of us ever could have possibly imagined. And I remember at the time my feeling of great vulnerability, but just also kind of like, well, what are we supposed to do and what's going on and where should we go and what should we do and so forth. And so I went out to the patio just to kind of like clear my head and sort of try and get a grip on what we should do. And I remember it being eerily quiet outside, except for one jet that was traveling westbound. And it seemed, you know, kind of low in altitude. And I just thought that that was very, very odd. And ironically enough, that was the plane that eventually turned around and was heading back towards the capital and ultimately ended up going down in Pennsylvania. So those are my recollections from what transpired on that day. And as far as what I felt a great sense of loss. I was angry. I wanted to know who was responsible, who could think of doing such a horrible thing. And then ultimately when the towers both collapsed, all I could think about were all my friends and associates that were in New York and wondering about how they were. And lastly, I think the biggest thing is that I was wondering, okay, what's the United States going to do now? We're a world superpower, and we just now have been hit at some of our most significant areas of economics. The Pentagon has been hit. There's so many unknowns at this point. So those are the kind of things that were going through my mind at that time. And last but not least, I was just incredibly taken by the overall unity of the American people afterwards, to come together, to drop all their grievances and differences, come together in a way and unite and say, you may have hit us where it hurts, but we're not done by any stretch, and we will come together and we will rebound from this. And that was something that gave me a great source of strength and comfort. Stand by. I'm recording. Okay, Sheila, where were you when 9/11 happened?
When 9/11 happened, I was in the lunchroom of my high school, and one of my friends next to me said, "Oh, there was a bomb or something at New York," and you know, at first it seemed so unreal. And then in the library, which was right next door to the cafeteria, they turned on the television, and we actually saw the two planes fly into the Twin Towers.
And what do you remember about that day?
I remember that it was a lot of panic, a lot of confusion. My people were leaving school, the streets were crowded, even here in Cleveland. And I just remember it was a very sad day. I remember going to the store, the Western Union line was crowded. I remember a lot of people making phone calls to their loved ones, pay phones full, just a lot of panic during that day.
And what were you feeling?
I was scared. I didn't know what was going on, and the fact that something had happened, like a terrorist attack, that close to me was really unbelievable. You know, the shock and the realization hadn't set in. I just know it was unreal.
And how did it make you feel?
It made me feel unsafe to know that something of that magnitude could happen so close.
And what sticks out to you as something that kind of gave you a sense of hope or comfort, you know, in the hours or whatever that followed after that?
the firefighters gave me a sense of hope because the firefighters were more or less the heroes during that event. They stuck together. They were dedicated into finding people, survivors of that. It gave me a sense of hope that even if something happened that close and it's that real, that someone would be there to help. Someone cares.
And what did you think, or what feeling did you have when you saw the towers come down?
Unbelief. I was amazed. It was almost like it wasn't real.
Good. Well, after in
Okay.
3, 2.
All right. The day started out like any other day. I was going to Kent State University. I was taking classes, and one of my teachers for the class was late, and she finally arrived about 10 minutes later, and she said, "We're under attack. We don't know why, and everybody just has to go home." So when I was leaving class, you know, everybody was in a panic. People were flocking towards the TVs trying to figure out what was going on. People were very confused, very, you know, panicky. They don't know what's going to happen next. And went home, watched TV myself, and I was very, you know, much disbelief.
What do you remember?
When they first attacked?
Or just from the event itself, what do you remember?
Not very much. I mean, it was just a lot of confusion. There was, you know, of course you would call, you know, your family members, your friends, and talk about it as in any kind of disastrous situation. You just want to talk to somebody, and it was just very surreal.
Do you remember anything about, like, did it seem incredibly quiet, like outside, or like?
It wasn't quiet. It was very, very noisy. I was, you know, when I was leaving campus, everybody was trying to race home. There was traffic jams. There was people just pouring out into the streets and running around, and it was very actually noisy.
And how did you feel? Were you angry, mad, sad?
No.
Worried?
I really wasn't affected by it.
Okay.
I mean, it's something I was just watching on TV, and you know, just trying to figure out the facts to things first to get, you know, before any kind of feeling struck. It was more of just trying to understand, and then finally you understood the magnitude of everything, and that's when it was kind of, you know, incredible to think that this kind of devastation happened.
Were you struck, you know, being a television professional and everything, were you struck about the reality of watching this unfold on television? Was that kind of like something that just...
I think it's glad that it was all captured on television. I think that, you know, that's... I hate being so insensitive, but it's a part of history, so you want to capture that on TV. I personally wasn't affected by anybody personally, so I don't have a strong feeling other than the human feeling of knowing that there were lives lost.
Okay. Go. I'm recording. Okay, Susan, where were you when 9/11 happened?
I was sitting in the office, and the NASA TV was on, and somebody came running in saying, "Did you see? Look at the TV. They've just bombed one of the towers."
And what do you remember about 9/11?
I remember being devastated, frightened, and then as you went on and you heard that they weren't sure what other sites were going to be affected, worried then about my children and what was going to happen.
And were you at the center here at that time?
Yes, I was.
And what happened here at the center? What was going on here at the center during that time?
It was one of the few moments that I can say that we actually had silence in the education department. Everybody was just stunned. We could not believe what we were seeing on TV. It was almost like you couldn't walk away.
And was there any sense of emergency or anything like that? From what I understand, Carol was saying people evacuated and all this kind of stuff. Do you recall any sense of immediacy?
Yes, I do, because as I mentioned before, I think once it sunk in and then we saw it might be more than one location, people were wondering, you know, if it hit here, would you want to be here or would you want to be with your family members? So I know myself had talked to my supervisor and took leave to go home and pick up my son from his school and my daughter.
And, you know, how did you feel at the time and how do you feel now in regard to 9/11?
I felt just devastation that this could happen in the United States, that although we're prepared and we cover all these aspects, we still, you know, it was a dire emergency and people still didn't know what to do, how to rally for help. How do I feel today? I feel that the threat is still out there, but we're better prepared, and I know itself, I feel that Glenn has a better way of communicating to us, you know, widespread what to do in such a nature.
And the last question is what sticks out to you most about 9/11 as far as like people coming together, or what specific things do you just make an immediate association with 9/11?
I think people coming together, and what I made the immediate association was of all the heroes that came out of that actually lost their lives to help save others, from firemen, policemen, but the co-workers you read about, people not leaving people by themselves. To me, that touched that human nature that we forget about. We forget about that, you know, we're human and we got to take care of each other.
Well, it really just was very horrific to me to see people falling out of buildings, and I was just really concerned about the families and the people that we're trying to rescue. I just really thought it was a horrific event, and I was concerned about repercussions for our future in the nation.
September 11th, 2001, I was in Richmond, Virginia.
What were you doing?
I was dropping off my son at preschool, and I had just had my second kid, and I remember having her in an infant carrier walking him into preschool.
And what did it mean to you?
Well, when I got the news, I actually got the news from another parent who was from New York but also living in Richmond, Virginia. And what it meant to me at that time, and even still today, is once we found out that there wasn't a mistake but that it was intentional, is seeing a country come together, every race, every creed, every color, every size, every religious background, really come together for one common cause, and that was for the freedoms of the United States. It meant that to me that day, and it means that to me today.
Okay, go.
On September 11, 2001, I was sitting at my desk in Building 500 when my husband called me to tell me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I went into the HR division office and notified my co-workers in the area, and we watched the TV as the second plane hit the second tower and eventually as the buildings collapsed. I remember the announcer saying the U.S. is under attack, and it sent chills down my spine. For the first time in my life, I felt fearful and threatened in my own country, and that made me unsettled. However, even though it was a very bad experience and frightening, I also felt there were some positive things that came out of it. It generated inside of me a greater sense of patriotism and pride in being an American. I felt that it was, it warmed my heart that people came together as a country and a nation to help one another and to have a common purpose. And that's what I remember about 9/11.
I'll tell you.
All that kind of stuff. Oh, okay. Okay, what was I doing on September 11th? I was here at NASA in Building 500, and I can remember sitting in a meeting and hearing about it, and that we all gathered in one room and just being very shocked, and then being on lockdown. They locked down Building 500, and watching a lot of people leave the lab and wondering what was going on. Finally, we were able to get out, and it took well over an hour and a half to get out of the lab. think the thing that I in terms of what it meant to me was 3 days later I had a trip to go to California vacation, and I actually went. And a lot of people thought, you know, why would you ever get on a plane 3 days after this happened? And there was only like 4 people on the plane, myself and 3 other people. And I think what was going through my mind at that time was thinking that so many things would never be the same. One of them which would be travel, and it never has been the same. I think of how easy it was to get on a plane and how hard it is now in terms of the security. And I guess the other thing that went through my mind is just thinking about how we take for granted so many things, and it was just a kind of a wake-up call. I remember on that whole flight, and thinking about how I was never afraid to fly, and I was just nervous that whole flight. But then when I got there safely, thinking, you know, things will be okay. They'll be different, but they'll be okay.
On September 11th, 2001, I was in 7th grade class. Once we heard about it, our teachers turned it on the TV and we watched it. I remember being sad about what happened and knowing that so many people were dying and other children were losing their parents. I was scared for my mom because she worked for NASA at the time, and she called the school and she told them that they were on lockdown, but as soon as they were off of lockdown, she was going to be on her way to pick me up. About an hour and a half later, she called back and said she was on her way. So at that point, I was pretty happy to know she was okay.
So I was on my way to work and listening to NPR when I heard news of an airplane hitting the tower. And I thought, wow, that's how awful, you know, how could somebody just run right into a big tower? I mean, what went wrong there? And it was pretty confusing. I thought, oh, that's horrible. Well, when I got to work, there's a television in the office, and I turned it on, and Ed Hoffman from Apple and his deputy were visiting Glenn Research Center at the time, and I was in training and development, and we had the TV on, and we're kind of watching things as it developed, and actually saw the second plane come in and hit the second tower. And it was obvious then that it wasn't an accident, that it was, you know, that it was a terrorist act. And I mean, we were just basically stunned and in disbelief. And there was lots of people. Meanwhile, word of the plane, the third plane being above Cleveland, had a lot of people in the office very upset, very frightened, wanting to leave. They had people who were working at the airport that they were in contact with who were giving them reports of this third plane. And it was just a very frightening time where we all kind of came together as an office and tried to make some sense out of it. Not that anyone could really make any sense out of it at the time. Of course, Ed and Tony had to figure out how to get back to Washington, and we had to figure out how to evacuate, and we did, as far as, you know, people being excused and leaving. And I know I just kind of wanted to stay there for a while. I wanted to stay until everyone was gone. It just made me feel better somehow. And the meaning I made of it was just, you know, sort of the end of innocence, you know, that people really hated us enough to really do something like this and to attack, you know, our, you know, the World Trade Towers, where, you know, they're kind of symbolic of our success as an economic nation. And, you know, just that, I think grief, just at that time. Later on is when I realized that the world had changed forever and it wasn't going to be the same again. It was more like when we attacked Iraq. It was clear that we were going to be really engaged in a whole new kind of conflict as a nation for another 40, 50 years anyway. So that's kind of what happened in my life on 9/11.
Okay. Where were you on September 11th, 2001?
I was pulling into GRC and I was parking my car. And as I was parking it, I had the radio on and I heard the news that there was a plane crash into one of the Twin Towers in New York City.
Okay. You already answered what were you doing. What did it mean to you?
It was quite devastating, not only because it was such a tragedy that happened here on our homeland in America, but it was also very personal because, you see, my siblings and I, we were born in Manhattan, New York City. And so that's our homeland. So it was even more so devastating to us because we had family members there and we needed to make sure that everyone was safe. And not only that, there were so many people that we knew that were friends of ours and we lost. However, it was just like so surreal to us. That's what it meant to us, and it's just like a never-ending story. You think you forget it, but you don't. So for America, I just hope that we will never be the same, yet never forget where we came from, and never forget that we are blessed to live in America.